Hi, good day everyone. I'm Victoria Mute and today I will be presenting the case on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. This case was brought forward by the World Health Organization, but they did not have the legal authority, so the United Nations General Assembly requested another opinion. The World Health Organization's question did not arise within the scope of the organization's activities as defined by its constitute. Under Article 57 of the United Nations Charter, it stated that the World Health Organization does have wide international responsibilities, but those responsibilities are restricted to the sphere of public health specifically and cannot encroach on the responsibilities of other parts of the United Nations system. The Charter provides in Article 96, paragraph 1, however, that the General Assembly or the Security Council may request the International Court of Justice to give an advisory opinion on any legal question. Therefore, the ICJ accepted the case as they saw no compelling reason to dispute the competence of the General Assembly in seizing the court, and the General Assembly posed the question, is the threat or use of nuclear weapons in any circumstance permitted under international law? Going forward, the ICJ looked at two main areas, which was 1, the use of force, and 2, armed conflict. When looking at the use of force, the United Nations Charter contained many provisions pertaining to the use of force, and the court therefore chose to focus on these three main articles. The first article is Article 2, which looked at paragraph 4 of the article under the United Nations Charter, and it states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. In other words, what the article is saying is that the threat or use of force against another state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations is actually prohibited. However, the Charter also notes that there are articles that highlight the legal side of the use or threat of use of force. Under Article 51 of the Charter, it recognizes the inherent right to self-defense when faced with an armed attack. And under Article 42, it also states that there is a lawful use of force where the Security Council can actually take military action in conformity with Chapter 8 of the Charter. And Chapter 8 of the Charter is very important because it provides the constitutional basis for the involvement of regional organizations in the maintenance of international peace and security for the Security Council, which the Security Council is primarily responsible for. Looking further at the use of force, the court noted that there were no specifications for the weapons they were referring to, and it neither prohibits nor permits the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Under Article 51, there are constraints in terms of self-defense as the condition of proportionality comes strongly into play, and the condition of proportionality is a customary law. Here the court referred to the case of the military and parliamentary activities in and against Nicaragua versus the United States as an example. And this example highlights the legality of self-defense only if it is proportional to the armed attack, a rule established in customary law. Therefore, the proportionality principle may not exclude the use of force of nuclear weapons as self-defense in all circumstances, but use of force as proportional under self-defense has to meet the requirements of armed conflict and more notably the rules of humanitarian law, which we will discuss later. Focusing on the language that the court also looked at, the court stated that the threat of use of force is just as illegal as the actual use of force. If the use of force is unlawful, then this therefore means that the threat of use of force is also unlawful. Now the court looked at armed conflict, and the court looked at these three main areas within armed conflict, which stated that there are specific rules in international law regulating the legality or illegality of the recourse of nuclear weapons. It also looked at the principles of humanitarian law and at the law of neutrality. So under the armed conflict, looking at humanitarian law, it was noted that the court saw that international customary law nor treaty law contained any specifications authorizing the use or threat of nuclear weapons, nor were there any specifications for its illegality of the use of nuclear weapons or the threat of use of nuclear weapons. For the threat or use of nuclear weapons to be illegal, they must be prohibited, not just have an absence of authorization. And there was no prohibition. The court then decided to try and find any areas where nuclear weaponry use would be prohibited, but there was no such evidence. Continuing with how the court looked at humanitarian law, the court also looked at the fabric of humanitarian law in reference to nuclear weapons, and it highlighted that the protection of the civilian population and civilian objects and the established distinction between combatants and non-combatants was extremely important to note. States must never make civilians the object of an attack and must consequently never use weapons that are incapable of distinguishing between civilians and military targets. Here it is forbidden to cause unnecessary suffering to combatants. Therefore, states do not have the unlimited freedom to choose which weapons they will use. The court also importantly referred to Martin's Clause, which was first included in the Hague Convention under the Laws and Customs of War on Land of 1899. And Martin's Clause states that in cases not covered by this protocol or by other international agreements, civilians and combatants remain under the protection and authority of the principles of international law derived from established customs, from the principles of humanity, and from the dictates of public conscience. The court found that Martin's Clause was an expression of pre-existing customary law, and it notes that Martin's Clause is extremely relevant and applicable today and is an affirmation that the principles and rules of humanitarian law apply under nuclear weapons. The court also notes that nuclear weapons were created after most of the rules and laws applicable under humanitarian law were put under armed conflict. There was also mentioned that the Geneva Convention conferences of 1949 and 1974 to 1977 left out nuclear weapons. They were left aside and not discussed. And further, the court noted that there are both qualitative and quantitative differences between nuclear weapons and other conventional weapons. Therefore, they need their own laws. The court then looked at the law of neutrality, and the law of neutrality applies to nations engaged in armed conflict and nations not taking part in these conflicts. The law's purpose is to localize war, limit the conduct of war, and to limit the impact of war in international commerce. The law of neutrality is established as a part of customary international law and states that nations have the option to refrain from participation in armed conflict and declare neutral status. The court found that the law of neutrality is applicable to all armed conflicts, whatever the types of weapons that are being used. So once the court went through all of the laws and all of the charters within the United Nations Charter and looked at many articles, they came to 6 main rulings. The first was that neither customary nor conventional international law had any specific authorization on the threat or use of nuclear weapons. This was a unanimous decision and a unanimous vote. Neither customary nor conventional international law had any comprehensive and universal prohibition of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. As such, this vote was 11-3. A threat or use of force by means of nuclear weapons that is contrary to Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter and that fails to meet all of the requirements of Article 51 is unlawful. This was unanimous. A threat or use of nuclear weapons should also be compatible with the requirements of the international law applicable in armed conflict, particularly those of the principles of rules of international humanitarian law, as well as with specific obligations under the treaties and other undertakings which expressly deal with nuclear weapons. This vote was unanimous as well. Then the court noted that the court cannot conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in extreme circumstances of self-defense, in which the very survival of the state would be at stake. This was voted on 7-7, and the president casted the deciding vote. Lastly, and very importantly, a unanimous decision was made that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that this case was very clear and understandable. These are the sources that I have used for the case, and I hope that you all have a good day.